Space race is a very interesting topic about technology, exploration, competition, and most obviously, space. You may be asking, what's the space race? The space race was a competition between two big powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, from 1957 to 1969. During the Cold War, these two countries were trying to develop rockets and technology that could go to space. There was fierce competition between the two countries. Both countries wanted to improve their military firepower, which would extend its political economic system, either freedom, the USA, or communism, with the USSR.
The space started during the Cold War in 1957. The two countries were trying to get missiles into space to threaten and possibly use against the other country. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets sent the world's first artificial satellite into space from a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. This was also the first man-made object to be placed in the Earth's orbit. This small satellite was named Sputnik.
History was changed on October 4th, 1957, when a satellite launched into space. This satellite, Sputnik, which is Russian for traveler, was only 58 centimeters in diameter and weighed 83.6 kilograms. Sputnik's launch came as a very big, and not very pleasant, surprise to most Americans. The U.S. saw space as the next frontier and thought it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. The incredible power of the R-7 missile, which launched Sputnik into space and was seemingly capable of launching nuclear warheads into the U.S., made gathering intelligence about the USSR's military activities suddenly urgent. Americans worried about their protection because the USSR could launch missiles into the U.S. easily. Then, the USSR struck again by sending Sputnik 2 into space. Sputnik II was launched into space on November 2nd, 1957. Sputnik II carried a dog named Laika into space. The U.S. tried to respond to this in December by launching Vanguard, but the satellite exploded shortly after takeoff. The U.S. finally responded on January 31st, 1958, by launching the Explorer I into space. The launch of Sputnik was the cause for creating NASA.
On July 29th, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Act was signed by the President Dwight D. Eisenhower, starting the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Association, or NASA. NASA was finished and officially created on October 1st, 1958. The Space Act legislated NASA as a civilian enterprise, and its purpose was to discover space, not to help in the military. While the Soviet Union was pursuing a highly military-industrial approach to their space program, NASA was created as a citizen enterprise, and its space development were to be used only for peaceful and scientific purposes. Because it was not a military-based program, unlike the Soviets, NASA was able to share its discoveries with the public and scientists, which allowed collaboration between American researchers and scientists, so research was much more effective. The Soviet program was dependent on military, so they had many difficulties in making scientific advancement, as the Soviets kept all their advances a secret. Eisenhower also created other national security programs that would operate simultaneously with NASA. The first would be led by the U.S. Air Force and try to exploit the military potential of space. The second would be led by the CIA, the Air Force, and a new organization called the National Reconnaissance Office. It would use orbiting satellites to gather intelligence on the Soviet Union and its allies.
In 1959, the Soviets launched Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. In April 1961, a Soviet astronaut, called a cosmonaut, named Yuri Gagarin, became the first man to orbit Earth, traveling in the spacecraft Vostok 1. This craft looked much different than the spaceship finally did, used by NASA, as it was a little round capsule. The U.S. started a project called Project Mercury to try to put a man into space. They designed a small cone-shaped capsule and tested it with chimpanzees. Their final test was completed successfully in March 1961, before Gagarin went to space. On May 5th, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. John F. Kennedy presented him with the NASA Distinguished Service Medal for doing this. Later that May, President John F. Kennedy declared that the U.S. would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade in a speech at Rice University. He said, "We choose to go to the moon this decade and do other things, but not because they are easy, but because they are hard." In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth, and by the end of 1962, the foundations of NASA's lunar landing program, Project Apollo, were in place.
When John F. Kennedy became the president, he requested the Soviet Union and the U.S. to work together for space exploration. Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, declined as he still believed in Soviet supremacy in rocketry. However, after John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth on February 20th, 1962, Khrushchev agreed to space cooperation. NASA's Deputy Administrator Hugh Dryden and Soviet academic Blag Kontovolov discussed the possibility of cooperation and then agreed to cooperate in a few areas of space exploration. Despite the agreement to cooperate in certain fields of space exploration, they still experienced a problem. The Soviet program was secretive in its discoveries, while NASA was not. Most of the leaders in the space program were kept anonymous for a while. Kaljisk was the chief theorist of cosmonautics, and his name wasn't known for years, and Sergei Korolev, the founder of the space and rocketry program and chief designer of cosmonautics, wasn't known until after his death.
From 1961 to 1964, NASA's budget was increased by almost 500%. On June 3, 1965, Edward H. White completed the first spacewalk in U.S. history. Apollo suffered a major setback in January 1967 when 3 astronauts were killed when their spaceship caught fire in a launch simulation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's program was moving slowly because they questioned its necessity, and the chief engineer of the program, Sergei Korolev, died unexpectedly in January 1966. December 1968 saw the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. Then on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched. This was the first attempt at a manned moon landing. They landed successfully on the moon on July 20th, bringing a close to the space race. Neil Armstrong, the first man to step on the moon, said the famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," as he was stepping onto the moon. When the astronauts landed back on Earth, they were quarantined because NASA thought they could have some germs on them from the moon that could be dangerous. When they landed on the moon, the U.S. won the space race. With the conclusion of the space race, the U.S. government's interest in lunar missions waned in the 1970s. In 1975, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts into space aboard an Apollo spacecraft that docked in orbit with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. The 2 commanders of the missions shook hands. It symbolized the improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations near the end of the Cold War.
The U.S. won the space race by putting a man on the moon before the astronauts were seen as heroes, while the Soviets were seen as ruthless villains who wanted to prove their superiority through the communist system. The defeat of the Soviets in the space race eventually led to better U.S.-Soviet relations, and the threat of nuclear weapons no longer floated above everyone's heads. The technology used for the space race brought more understanding of space and allowed for further space exploration. The satellites eventually brought the internet and cell phones, allowing for more easily accessed information and improved communication. The space race has brought us many benefits that affect our lives now and will continue to affect us in the future.